Imagine a dimly lit room. No flags, no crowds, no shouting. Just a mind. An obsessive, brilliant, resentful, and dangerous mind. Today we're not going to talk about the Third Reich as a military machine, nor about battles or death tolls. Today we're entering a far more uncomfortable place, the mind of the man who taught millions how to hate, how to believe, and how to obey. Joseph Goebbels wasn't the one who pulled the trigger or signed the final orders. He was something perhaps worse, the one who made everything feel necessary. The man who turned fear into virtue, fanaticism into duty, and lies into emotional truth. To understand how an entire society could march toward the abyss, we first have to understand the person who told them the abyss was a path. This is not a heroic portrait, nor is it a cartoonish depiction of evil. Goebbels wasn't born a monster. He was born a sickly, insecure child, desperate to be seen. And that's where it all begins. Because the most destructive ideologies rarely emerge from strength, but from a wound. Over the next hour, we won't hear what Goebbels said to the masses, but what he likely told himself. His fears, his contradictions, his pathological need for recognition. We'll see how a frustrated intellectual became the architect of one of the greatest manipulation machines in history, and how, step by step, he lost the ability to distinguish between the propaganda he created and the reality he helped destroy. Understanding Goebbels does not mean justifying him. It means something far more dangerous and necessary. Recognizing that his mind was not alien to the human condition, that his psychological mechanisms are still alive, that his way of lying did not disappear with the end of the war. So turn off the outside noise. For the next few minutes, we won't observe the past from a distance. We're going to sit inside the mind of Joseph Goebbels. And what we find there says as much about us as it does about him. Joseph Goebbels came into the world at the end of the 19th century, in a Germany that still believed in order, discipline, and progress. He was born into a modest, Catholic, strict family, where duty weighed more than affection and obedience was a form of love. From the very beginning, his relationship with the world was marked by a difference he would never fully accept. During his childhood, a bone disease deformed his right leg. It wasn't an injury obvious at first glance, but it was enough to prevent him from running, playing, or competing like other children. While others built their identity through the body and physical strength, Goebbels learned to observe from the outside. The humiliation was not always explicit, but it was constant. Glances, silences, comparisons. He couldn't earn respect through his body, so he began to seek it through his mind. The wound was not only physical, it was psychological. The feeling of being different, incomplete, inferior became a fixed idea. And alongside it, something more dangerous was born. The conviction that the world owed him something. It wasn't simply sadness, it was resentment. A quiet resentment that grew over the years. Goebbels found refuge in books. Reading didn't hurt him. Thinking didn't make him feel weak. In literature, philosophy, and history, he began to construct an ideal image of himself, not as he was, but as he believed he deserved to be. Intelligent, profound, destined for something great. This fantasy was not innocent. It was a defense mechanism. The smaller he felt in reality, the more grand his inner image had to become. At school, he stood out for his intelligence, but not for his character. He was brilliant, yes, but also arrogant, hypersensitive, and prone to feeling attacked. Any criticism felt like an assault. Any rejection, like an intolerable injustice. Here, a pattern begins to form that would follow him throughout his life. An inability to accept failure as something of his own making. His academic training was extensive. He studied literature, history, and philosophy at several German universities. He earned a doctorate, reaching an intellectual level many would never achieve. And yet, it was never enough. Because his problem was not a lack of talent, but a lack of recognition. The world did not applaud him as he believed he deserved, and for someone like Goebbels, that was unbearable. During these years, his identity began to fracture. On one side, the refined intellectual who despised the masses. On the other, the bitter young man who blamed society for not giving him his rightful place. This contradiction is key. Goebbels did not hate the system because it was unjust, but because it had failed to crown him. In his mind, a dangerous idea began to take shape. If the world did not recognize him, then the world must be wrong. And if the world was wrong, it had to be remade, not out of justice, but out of revenge. Goebbels' childhood does not explain his crimes, but it does explain his emptiness. An emptiness he never tried to heal, only to fill. And that emptiness over time would need something bigger than books. It would need a cause, an enemy, and a crowd willing to listen. When Joseph Goebbels finished his academic training, he was convinced of one thing. He was superior to most people, not in strength, not in physical charisma, but in intelligence, sensitivity, and intellectual depth. In his mind, the world simply had to discover him. But the world didn't. Goebbels wanted to be a writer, not just any writer, but a great name in German literature. He dreamed of transcendent novels, of cultural recognition, of applause that was quiet, but eternal. He wrote diaries, poems, plays, short stories, and again he ran into the same wall: rejection, publishers that never replied, lukewarm criticism, silence. For someone with fragile self-esteem and an oversized ego, silence was the worst humiliation of all. Here, a deep fracture takes hold. Goebbels did not see failure as part of the creative process, but as an implicit conspiracy. If his talent wasn't being recognized, there had to be an external reason. The problem was never the work, it was always the environment. This way of thinking shielded him from pain, but pushed him steadily toward resentment. Meanwhile, his material life was unstable. He drifted through minor, poorly paid jobs that he considered unworthy of his intellect. Each workday reinforced the idea that he was trapped in a mediocre world, ruled by inferior people. Contempt for society began to mix with envy. He didn't hate other people's success because it was immoral, but because it wasn't his. In his diaries, which he kept obsessively, a contradictory Goebbels appears. At times, he presents himself as a misunderstood genius. At others, he sinks into self-pity, portraying himself as a victim of fate. This emotional back and forth reveals a core trait of his personality: an unstable identity, dependent on external validation. During these years, Goebbels wasn't yet a political fanatic, but he was already a man dangerously prepared to become one. His frustration was searching for a narrative that could give it meaning. He needed a clear explanation for why he, with all his talent, was excluded from the recognition he believed he deserved. His thinking then begins to radicalize, not violently, but intellectually. He gravitates toward nationalist, romantic, idealized ideas. Germany, humiliated after the war, starts to feel like a mirror of himself. Wounded, despised, misunderstood. The identification is immediate. His personal failure fuses with a collective one. This is where something decisive happens. Goebbels stops wanting to improve the world through art and begins to want to transform it through imposition. Words are no longer creation, they are weapons. The intellectual starts to discover the pleasure of aggressive rhetoric, of moral attack, of simplification. The frustrated writer begins to die. In his place, the polemicist is born. The man who was never read now wants to be heard at any cost. Because when talent finds no recognition and the ego accepts no limits, frustration looks for power. And Goebbels, without yet realizing it, was about to find a movement that would turn his resentment into a mission. Joseph Goebbels did not arrive at Nazism as a blind fanatic from the very beginning. He arrived as someone searching for something, meaning, belonging, a cause that would allow him to reinterpret his life not as a personal failure, but as a historical injustice. And the National Socialist movement knew how to offer him exactly that. In the early years of his involvement with the party, Goebbels wasn't yet the ruthless propagandist history remembers. He hesitated. He questioned. He even disagreed at times with key figures in the movement. But what mattered wasn't ideological consistency. It was the emotion Nazism awakened in him. For the first time, his words did not fall into a void. For the first time, someone was listening. The party offered him something literature never had: an audience, visibility, reaction. Every speech, every pamphlet, every article provoked a response: applause, outrage, fervor. For someone with a pathological need for recognition, this was a revelation. Goebbels realized he didn't need to be loved for his talent. It was enough to be feared or followed for his voice. Psychologically, Nazism functioned as a structure that organized his inner chaos. It gave him clear enemies, clearly defined culprits, a simple narrative to explain a complex reality. He was no longer a failed individual. He was part of a struggle. And within that struggle, his resentment ceased to be a weakness and became a virtue. Anti-Semitism, in particular, did not appear by accident. It was an emotional response. It offered an easy explanation for his frustration while allowing him to feel superior. It wasn't that he had failed. Others had corrupted the system. This logic not only soothed his ego, it gave him a moral mission. Goebbels began to write and speak with a verbal violence he had never shown before. His texts no longer sought depth, but impact. He didn't want to persuade, he wanted to mobilize. He grasped something crucial. Truth doesn't move the masses, emotion does. And the more extreme the emotion, the greater the effect. Within the party, his rhetorical talent did not go unnoticed. For the first time in his life, his intelligence was useful, not to create beauty, but to shape perception. This reinforced a key transformation in his character. He stopped seeing himself as a marginal intellectual and began to see himself as a historical instrument. Here, a profound psychological shift takes hold. Goebbels no longer needed to ask who he was. The movement gave him a prefabricated identity, and accepting that identity meant abandoning doubt, self-criticism, and inner conflict. In return, he received absolute certainty. Nazism did not turn him into what he became. It simply gave him permission to be it. It offered him a cause that legitimized his hatred, a stage for his talent, and a promise of greatness that life had never fulfilled. For the first time, Joseph Goebbels felt that his mind finally had a place in the world, and that discovery would be irreversible. The first encounter between Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler was not merely political. It was emotional, almost intimate. Goebbels did not see Hitler as just another leader. He saw a figure who filled all his voids at once: authority, destiny, greatness, and meaning. From that moment on, their relationship ceased to be rational. In his diaries, Goebbels describes Hitler in language that borders on the religious. He does not speak of a man, but of a revelation. Hitler was not only the head of the movement, he was the embodiment of everything Goebbels had always wanted to be and never could: strong, admired, followed without question. Where Goebbels was doubt and wound, Hitler was certainty. Psychologically, this relationship was one of absolute dependence. Goebbels needed Hitler in order to define himself. His identity stopped being individual and became reflective. Thinking like Hitler, speaking like Hitler, anticipating what Hitler wanted even before he said it, not because he was ordered to, but because he wanted to. Here, a key trait emerges: voluntary submission. Goebbels was not a mere subordinate, he was a believer. He renounced critical thought not out of fear, but out of ideological love. In Hitler, he found the idealized father figure he had never had. Infallible, strong, unquestionable. And like all fanatical believers, he turned that devotion into aggression toward the outside world. Every compliment from Hitler reinforced his self-esteem. Every gesture of closeness elevated him. But every moment of distance terrified him as well. Goebbels lived emotionally dependent on the Führer's approval. His loyalty had no limits because his identity depended on it. Without Hitler, Goebbels was once again the frustrated intellectual. With Hitler, he became someone historical. This relationship also explains his progressive radicalization. Goebbels did not seek merely to serve the regime. He sought to prove that he was the most loyal, the harshest, the most ruthless. In his mind, extremism was a form of love. The further he went, the more worthy he would be of his leader's gaze. Over time, Goebbels stopped distinguishing between Hitler's will and his own. He became his voice, his emotional translator to the masses. He did not need detailed orders, he understood the spirit. And that made him especially dangerous, because he no longer acted out of obedience, but out of absolute conviction. Hitler gave Goebbels what he had always sought, a place in history, and Goebbels, in return, gave him something invaluable: his mind, his morality, and his ability to turn millions into believers. It wasn't just propaganda, it was devotion transformed into power. Joseph Goebbels did not invent the political lie, but he understood something that few before him had grasped so clearly. Truth does not need to be destroyed, it only needs to be replaced. And to do that, you don't have to convince the mind, you have to capture emotion. Goebbels did not see the masses as individuals, but as an organism, a collective entity that reacted predictably when the right keys were pressed. Fear, pride, humiliation, hope. His genius wasn't in creating new ideas, but in simplifying them until they became irresistible. The simpler the message, the deeper the impact. From his psychological perspective, propaganda was not a moral deception, but a legitimate tool. He did not ask whether something was true, but whether it was effective. And that distinction is crucial, because when effectiveness replaces truth as the standard, anything becomes possible. Goebbels understood that repeating a lie does not turn it into truth, but it does turn it into something familiar. And familiarity is comforting. Repetition creates a sense of order in the midst of chaos. That is why he insisted again and again on the same messages, the same words, the same enemies. He was not trying to convince the skeptic, but to numb the exhausted. He also understood the power of rhythm, constant news, continuous speeches, uninterrupted stimulation. No space to think, because thinking requires silence, and silence was dangerous. In his world, propaganda never slept. There was always a headline, a slogan, an emotion ready to fill the void. Unlike other ideologues, Goebbels knew perfectly well that he was lying. He did not deceive himself on that point. And paradoxically, that made him more dangerous. His cynicism allowed him to adjust the message without remorse. If one narrative didn't work, it was changed. If one enemy no longer served its purpose, it was replaced by another. Morality was flexible. The objective was absolute. Cinema, radio, public rallies, even art itself, were turned into extensions of his mind. Everything had to tell the same story from different angles. It didn't matter if someone doubted. What mattered was that no one could escape the message. Propaganda didn't have to be believed. It had to be breathed. Here lies one of Goebbels' most disturbing paradoxes. He deeply despised the masses, yet understood them better than anyone. He manipulated them because he saw them as inferior, but he depended on them to exist. His power only made sense if it was seen, celebrated, amplified. Over time, propaganda ceased to be just a political tool and became his way of seeing the world. Goebbels began to interpret reality as a narrative stage. Defeats were not defeats, they were trials. Failures did not exist, only betrayals. Everything could be rewritten. And at that point, the lie was no longer a means. It was his home. Joseph Goebbels constructed a world divided into two planes that rarely touched: public discourse and private life. Far from seeing this as a contradiction, he experienced it as a necessity. For him, moral coherence was not a virtue, it was an obstacle. While he preached sacrifice, purity, and absolute discipline to the German people, his personal life was marked by excess, privilege, and desire. Extramarital affairs, luxuries reserved for the ruling elite, indulgences that would never have been tolerated in an ordinary citizen. But Goebbels did not see himself as part of that mass. He was the exception, the chosen one. This is where a key psychological mechanism comes into play: cognitive dissonance. When his actions clashed with his rhetoric, he didn't change his behavior, he changed the explanation. Everything found a higher justification. His desires were not weaknesses, they were rewards. His privileges were not hypocrisy, they were necessary tools to fulfill a historical mission. Goebbels felt no guilt because he had redefined morality to suit himself. Good and evil were not universal categories, but instruments in service of the cause. If something strengthened the regime, it was good. If it weakened it, it was bad. The content of the act didn't matter, only its political usefulness. This self-deception was not accidental, it was systematic. Goebbels needed to believe his own narrative to survive psychologically. Admitting hypocrisy would have meant accepting that his entire ideological structure rested on a lie, something his mind could not tolerate. Even in his relationship to the suffering of others, the dissonance was obvious. He could speak of sacrifice with absolute coldness, while carefully shielding himself from it. Pain was a rhetorical tool, not a shared experience. The people were meant to endure, he was meant to direct. Most disturbing of all, this double standard did not weaken his fanaticism, it reinforced it. Each contradiction resolved through justification pulled him deeper into the system. The more he lied, the more he needed to keep lying in order not to face himself. Forward flight became his only option. Over time, Goebbels stopped perceiving the difference between cynicism and conviction. He began to believe that his lack of scruples was a higher form of clarity, that others were naive for clinging to principles, while he understood how power truly worked. In this way, cognitive dissonance did not fracture him, it armored him. It allowed him to live without guilt inside an ideology that demanded total sacrifice, as long as it was demanded of others. For years, Joseph Goebbels lived in a world he could control with words. As the regime advanced, propaganda didn't merely mask reality, it replaced it. But every narrative has its limits, and Goebbels began to crack when reality stopped being flexible. Military defeats started to pile up. Cities destroyed, armies retreating, allies disappearing. For the first time, propaganda no longer had victories to exaggerate, only ruins to explain. And explaining disaster is far harder than glorifying success. Psychologically, this moment was devastating for Goebbels. His entire identity was built on the idea of narrative control. He didn't know how to win wars. He knew how to tell stories. And now, the story refused to be told. His response was not moderation, but radicalization. When propaganda stops persuading, it turns up the volume. His speeches grew more hysterical, more apocalyptic, more extreme. He no longer promised prosperity, he promised resistance. He no longer spoke of the future, he spoke of honor in defeat. The language changed, Because the mind had entered survival mode. Here, a key psychological phenomenon emerges: active denial. Goebbels did not ignore reality. He fought it. Every negative fact was reinterpreted as betrayal, sabotage, or moral weakness in the people. If citizens doubted, it wasn't because the war was lost, but because they didn't believe enough. The problem was never the ideology, only insufficient faith. As collapse drew closer, Goebbels began demanding total sacrifice, not because he truly believed victory was still possible, but because he could not conceive of a world without the regime. His fear was not losing the war, it was losing the narrative, losing the cause, losing his identity. Propaganda, once a tool of control, became a mental cage. Goebbels could no longer admit defeat without destroying himself. Accepting reality meant accepting that his entire life had been a construction built on manipulation. And that thought was unbearable. At this point, his discourse stopped being aimed at the people and began to be aimed at himself. Every word was a desperate attempt to hold together an identity that was falling apart. He no longer manipulated to persuade. He manipulated to avoid collapse. Goebbels' downfall was not quiet. It was loud, desperate, and fanatical. Because when someone has lived entirely inside a lie they control, the moment that lie stops working does not bring clarity. It brings panic. And panic, in a mind like his, could only lead to an extreme end. In his final days, Joseph Goebbels was no longer fighting for Germany. He was fighting for the meaning of his own existence. Sealed inside the bunker, surrounded by physical and mental ruins, the outside world had ceased to matter. Only one question remained: how does a life built entirely on an idea come to an end? As Berlin collapsed, Goebbels kept writing, speaking, issuing orders. Not because he truly believed in victory, but because he knew no other way to exist. Silence was his enemy. To think without propaganda was to face the void. And the void, for someone like him, was worse than death. Here we see the purest expression of his psychology: fanatical coherence. Goebbels could not survive the fall of the regime because the regime was him. There was no after, no identity outside the cause. To live meant accepting that everything he had done, said, and justified had been in vain. To die, by contrast, allowed him to preserve the illusion of meaning. His final decision was not impulsive, it was logical within his mental system. If the world could not exist under the ideology, then the world did not deserve to exist. Neither did he. This is the extreme conclusion of totalitarian thinking. When the idea is worth more than life, even one's own life becomes expendable. The most disturbing act was not his death, but that of his children. Not as a gesture of sudden madness, but as an ideological decision. Goebbels could not conceive of them growing up in a world without the myth. For him, a life outside the narrative was a life without value. Fanaticism had devoured the very last remnants of humanity. In the bunker, Goebbels showed no doubt. He showed conviction to the very end. And that is what is truly unsettling. He did not break. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not awaken. He died exactly as he had chosen to be, a man who preferred to destroy everything rather than accept the defeat of his narrative. His end was not that of a coward fleeing, but of a fanatic closing the circle. The mind that had manipulated reality for years ultimately chose to disappear along with it. And so Joseph Goebbels ended, not as a genius of propaganda, but as its final victim,